is titled Scrooge and Christmas, How Christmas Past Affected Christmas Present. And I was talking with the cast last night during warm-ups, and I reminded them that for millennia, people have been coming together at this time of the year to celebrate life. That first was embodied in the winter solstice, this time where the sun reaches the furthest point it's going to reach in the cycle before it starts making its way back up to springtime and summer, and that time of the year where we look at our loved ones and we say, thank you for celebrating and being here with me, thank you, we've made it through the warm weather, we've made it through the harvest, we have put our stores away, and we hope to make it through the darkness. But this reminder that also says that the darkness is going to end because the sun has already started its move up. So I thought I would start tonight with just a basic history of how Christmas and solstice came together and became so closely intertwined. Sometime between 270 and 275 ACE, the Roman Emperor Aurelian tagged the title of this winter solstice the Dies Natalis Solis Invictis, which means the day of birth for the sun invincible, or as one translation said, the birthday of the unconquerable sun. For the sun has come as far as it's going to go, and now slowly it's going to make its way through back up to the spring. During his reign, the Emperor Constantine, his reign began in 306. He begins and takes the pagan holiday of winter solstice, and of course Constantine's the Christian emperor, and he brings it together and he says this is going to be the day that we celebrate the birth of Jesus. And they take several of the ideas that had been celebrated with the solstice, ideas of evergreen, the use of trees, and evergreen trees specifically, the ivy and the holly, and they bring those traditions in, the feasting and the partying, all those things come together. We just switch the meaning a little bit, but those two come to be married together, and both secular and sacred community are going to celebrate that together. This is going to continue on through the Middle Ages. It's going to be this combination of the pagan and the Christian. We see the ivy and the holly and the evergreen continue through the Middle Ages, but we also see the tradition of gift giving. Predominantly, though, during the Middle Ages, the gift giving is going to be between people who have a contract with one another. So, for instance, a landlord to a tenant, that gift is going to be given, not necessarily between family members as we expect today. There's going to be eating, dancing, sport, and game. There's also going to be lavish feasts and huge masquerade parties. In 1607, King James I himself was known to have ordered a play performance and for the playing of games at court to celebrate Christmas. The folklore tells us that during his life, which of course was 1483 to 1546, Martin Luther, like I said, this is legend, was that he was the first person to put lights on the Christmas tree to celebrate the light of the world, the ever-glowing. Now, mind you, we don't have historic recollection of that until about 100 years later, but folklore tells us it was Martin Luther. It's a great story. It's not going to be until Oliver Cromwell's reign over England that we see Christmas actually get into trouble. His reign was 1653 to 1658. Oliver Cromwell, of course, was a Puritan, and Puritans didn't like anything fun. So drab attire, no makeup for the ladies, very drab food. We work, and then we go to sleep, and that's what God wants us to do, and at the end of this, we'll get heaven, and it'll be worth it. And so, in the meantime, I have to take every fun that you get out of life away as well, so that we can all focus on our religion. And so that's exactly what Oliver Cromwell does, is he bans Christmas. He only actually, in fact, he does away with most feast days. But what he does in exchange is he adds one day of the month for fasting. I don't know how on earth you regulate that, but rather than having feast days, one day a month we will have a fast. And that's how much we're going to be focusing on our religion. It came to the point that toward the end of his reign, he was actually sending soldiers through the towns to to find savory treats being cooked on Christmas. And then they would find these people. They didn't lock them up or anything. They took their food and fined them. Obviously, this was not very popular. And it was at least part of the reason why Charles II gets restored and the royal family gets restored. And of course, once he does, we see Christmas back in full celebration. Now, what's interesting about that is if we look back at Oliver Cromwell, of course, his puritanical reign over England didn't last, but all of his brethren decided to travel the seas, and they come, of course, to the New World. And when they come to what will eventually become America, they settle what they want to be settled, which is all the puritanical rules that Oliver Cromwell agreed to. And so I actually found this public notice, this is a picture of an old facsimile, that was used in Boston in the 1700s, and it reads, "Public notice. The observation of Christmas having been deemed a sacrilege, the exchanging of gifts and greetings, dressing in fine clothing, feasting, and similar satanical practices are hereby forbidden, with the offender liable to a fine of 5 shillings. And that's Boston. However, so it's starting to go out of style by the late 1820s, but it doesn't stay that way. As early as 1832, we have writings from Queen Victoria, who talks about her aunt. Her aunt was a Habsburg, right, Germanic, and the Germans loved Au Tannenbaum, yes? And her aunt had brought a Christmas tree into the palace. And she writes in her journals as a child of remembering how glorious it was to have this evergreen in the palace as a child. Of course, later she marries Prince Albert. Prince Albert, also from Germanic descent, brings the Christmas tree into Buckingham Palace as early as 1841, and it becomes an ongoing tradition there at the palace. It's in 1843 that Charles Dickens publishes A Christmas Carol. It's the same year that Sir Henry Cole creates the first commercially produced Christmas card. So I won't say that A Christmas Carol is the reason we celebrate Christmas today. I don't think that's the case. But many things were moving in the direction of Christmas becoming popular again in the social climate. By 1848, an illustration had been done of Prince Albert and Queen Victoria and the royal family in front of the Buckingham Palace Christmas tree, and it was published in London. In 1850, it was reproduced and published in America. And by 1870, both Britain and America, it's very common for you to see Christmas trees at Christmas time. And so this time period is certainly the reason why we still have Christmas as important to us today, because these are the folks that put it into motion. But it's not necessarily the fact that he wrote A Christmas Carol that gave us all of our Christmas traditions. Mind you, he gave us several. The term Merry Christmas, which we say, is first published in Christmas Carol. The reference to Scrooge. We all think of Scrooge as a miser. In fact, I don't know anybody who still uses that surname. If we ever meet that person, you're going to immediately judge them harshly, because to us, a Scrooge is a miserly person. The term bah humbug, of course, is still codified in our use of the language because of Charles Dickens' character in this story. So what are the things in Christmas Carol that are still a part of our Christmas tradition today? Well, I think we can break down a couple of reasons in Christmas Carol why it's still important to us in our celebration. The first of which is the idea that spirits and the divine intervention are important to us. From the very beginning, someone last night, one of the cast members was telling us that someone last night had very, very small children, and she said, "We enjoyed the show. I enjoyed the show. It may be a little PG-13. It's a little scary." And she's not wrong if you've ever read the book. In fact, if you were to see the original title is A Christmas Carol in Prose, being a ghost story of Christmas. And he sets it up from the very first page that this is going to be a ghost story, and that divine intervention and the spirit world is going to be a heavy part of the plot line. For example, the first lines. Marley was dead to begin with. There is no doubt whatever about that. The register of his burial was signed by the clergyman, the clerk, the undertaker, and the chief mourner. Scrooge signed it, and Scrooge's name was good upon exchange for anything he chose to put his hand to. Old Marley was as dead as a doornail. Mind, I don't mean to say that I know of my own knowledge what there is particularly dead about a doornail. I might have been inclined myself to regard a coffin nail as the deadest piece of ironmongering in this trade. But the wisdom of our ancestors is in the simile, and my unhallowed hands shall not disturb it, or the country's done for. You will therefore permit me to repeat emphatically that Marley was as dead as a doornail. The mention of Marley's funeral brings me back to the point I started from. There is no doubt that Marley was dead. This must be distinctly understood, or nothing wonderful can come of the story I am going to relate. He sets it up from the very beginning that this is going to be a ghost story, that it's going to be the spirits are going to play heavily in the story. That spirits and the signs that they bring to us are important. The second thing I would say that Dickens brings to us and our celebration of Christmas today is nostalgia. This thinking back to Christmas gone by. As the song says, here we are as in olden days, happy golden days of yore. Yes, we love the celebration of the nostalgic side of Christmas. And if you look at Christmas Carol, the second stave spends its entire time dealing with Scrooge going back and seeing what Christmas was like during his childhood and during his youth. Stave 2, of course, is the time he spends with the ghost of Christmas past. And one of the things that's so interesting is that then we move into stave 3, where the majority of his time is spent dealing with Tiny Tim and the Cratchits and the experience Tiny Tim is having in this Christmas time. He also deals with his nephew Fred and the memories that his nephew brings of his sister, who he talks about being a much sweeter part of life than he was, and when she is taken from him at a very young age, it's part of what causes his anger. So there's all of this connection to the idea of going back in nostalgia to what Christmas was like. And in that looking back, finding what is important today. The other side of the nostalgia is that Christmas is a time for children. Christmas is a time when children are the focal point. And if we think about that today, of course that's still a part of Christmas tradition today. That idea of maintaining the magic as long as we can, of Santa and gifts and the special time of year. In Christmas Carol, we specifically see him refer back to a boy at his office door who comes in the first stave and sings, God rest ye merry gentlemen, and before he can even get to the next line, Scrooge has scared him into running away. In the fifth stave, we see a boy who shows up at his window and he says, hey you, do you know that goose? And he says, the one as big as me? Yes, of course, the one as big as you. And he has this wonderful experience with these children, both at the beginning and at the end of the tale that's being told. This also brings us to a point that nostalgia gives us today, which is that Christmas celebration as of this point is about home. It's about the hearth. It's about family, certainly, close friends, and celebrating that time together. Before this, it has been very much about the community. Festivals are going to be experienced at church and as the community as a whole. This Victorian tradition brings us to what we expect now, which is on Christmas Eve, we're with our family or our dearest of friends to celebrate the holiday close to home. Third, Christmas is a time of merriment. I mentioned before that he codified the term Merry Christmas. I make merry for Christmas. Dickens actually seems to fight against the puritanical approach to Christmas. If we look at Scrooge, Scrooge is dressed as Dickens described it, very blandly. He wears, yes, his clothes are a part of the style of the time, but they're not particularly new. He doesn't take very good care of himself. He's unshaven. He goes to work. He works nonstop, and then he goes home to an enormous house. The book actually describes him seeing an apparition. Right after he sees Marley's ghost in the door knocker, he has an apparition that he sees an apparition rather, of a hearse drawn by 4 horses moving down the stairway, because the stairway is that big. But of course he lives in the smallest corner of this house. He eats only gruel, he has a tiny fire, and then he goes to bed and he gets up the next day and he does it all over again. And in my opinion, this is very much Dickens attacking that old idea of the puritanical being against Christmas. That the puritanical turns into a miserly function. And thus by Scrooge being redeemed, he leaves and comes back over to this time of community and merriment for everyone. And through this, of course, he gains redemption. Redemption, that's another part of the Christmas story that Dickens has to tell, is that by looking back to the past and changing these ways in the present, that he finds redemption, and that in that redemption is merriment. We see Scrooge described at the very beginning as being all about his business. In fact, in that first page, we see he's simply about his business. There's a line there that I omitted where they say that even on Marley's funeral day, Scrooge still managed to strike a bargain. And that was how he deemed it a good day. But merriment requires more than one person. Have you thought about that? Like, you don't hear a whole lot of stories of people being merry by themselves. Not without alcohol, I guess. But it's usually, we don't think of it, it's a sad merriment. But in order for Scrooge to be fully redeemed, he comes back to the community and he meets with, he goes to church. They say at the end of the story, he goes to his nephew's party, he engages with the community and thus is redeemed as well. And of course, this brings us to the fifth thing that Dickens is telling us, which is that Christmas is a time for remembering the poor. The poor, specifically in Victorian era, it's not a good time to be poor. If there's ever a good time to be poor, it's not during the Victorian era. In 1834, there was actually a law passed called the Poor Law of 1834. This is a quote about this law. The Poor Law of 1834 divided the poor into the deserving and the undeserving. The help provided to the deserving was scant indeed, more theory than fact, and it was almost impossible to prove one was deserving. The decision truly rested with people who sat on the boards of directors of workhouses or other persons living in comfort that was derived from profits expanded in part by paying out only very little to help those in need. Whatever its intention, the Poor Law provided a mere facade of welfare. In fact, it was a series of impossible obstacles. And of course, it's in 1838 that Dickens writes his tome to the workhouses and to the working poor called Oliver Twist. 5 years later, he still is referring back to this in A Christmas Carol. And so we see this idea of remembering the poor as an important part of the redemption of Christmas. We see, first of all, an example of Scrooge purely as the businessman. This is the point in the story where his nephew has been chased away and the solicitors have arrived. And they ask him, "What shall I put you down for charity?" "Nothing," Scrooge replied. "You wish to be anonymous?" "I wish to be left alone," said Scrooge. "Since you ask me what I wish, gentlemen, that is my answer. I don't make merry myself at Christmas, and I can't afford to make idle people merry. I help to support the establishments I have mentioned. They cost enough, and those who are badly off must go there." The reply is, "Many can't go there, and many would rather die." "If they would rather die," said Scrooge, "they had better do it and decrease the surplus population. Besides, excuse me, I don't know that." "But you might know it," observed the gentleman. "It's not my business," Scrooge returned. It's enough for a man to understand his own business and not to interfere with other people's. Mine occupies me constantly. Good afternoon, gentlemen. That's quite a bit of a change than what we see during his time when he has gone back with the Ghost of Christmas Past. He's having seen his childhood self. It says, then, with a rapidity of transition very foreign to his usual character, he said, in pity of his former self, poor boy, and cried again. I wish, Scrooge muttered, putting his hand in his pocket and looking after him after drying his eyes with his cuff. But it's too late now. What is the matter? Asked the spirit. Nothing, said Scrooge, nothing. There was a boy singing a Christmas carol at my door last night. I should like to have given him something. That's all. Later in the same stage, after returning to his youth and seeing the wonderful party that his boss Fezziwig and his wife have thrown for everybody, the spirit signed to him to listen to the two apprentices who were pouring out their hearts in praise of Fezziwig. And when he had done so, he said, Why is it not? He has spent but a few pounds of your mortal money, 3 or 4 perhaps. Is that so much that he deserves this praise? It isn't that, said Scrooge, heated by the remark and speaking unconsciously like his former, not his latter self. It isn't that, spirit. He has the power to render us happy or unhappy, to make our service light or burdensome, a pleasure or a toil. Say that his power lies in words and looks, in things so slight and insignificant that it is impossible to add and count them up. What then? The business he gives is quite as great as if it cost a fortune. He felt the spirit's glance and stopped. What is the matter? asked the ghost. Nothing particular, said Scrooge. Something, I think, the ghost insisted. No, said Scrooge. No, I should like to be able to say a word or two to my clerk just now. That's all. And so through this idea of going back in time and remembering this nostalgic time of his childhood, both good and bad, he doesn't just go back and see how good Christmas was. He also sees how rough it was at times. But by going back, he finds this redemption, so that by the time we get to the end of the book, it has this to say of him. Scrooge was better than his word. He did it all and infinitely more. And to Tiny Tim, who did not die, he was a second father. He became as good a friend, as good a master, and as good a man as the good old city knew, or any other good old city, town, or borough in the good old world. And it was always said of him that he knew how to keep Christmas well. If any man alive possessed the knowledge, may that truly be said of us and all of us. Through the redemption, it comes back and allows him to completely change his life. 1843, Dickens writes this book. In 1844, there were 9 productions in London. 9, the year after. By 1852, as you'll remember from my talk about Edwin Drood last year, he's traveling himself and reading from Christmas Carol. Dramatic readings on the road. At this point, there are hundreds, maybe thousands of adaptations of this story. I started to count through the number of films that I was able to find, and I just lost count. There are plays. When we decided to do Christmas Carol, the last question we asked ourselves was, which version are we doing? Because there are so many versions out there. There are musicals. There's at least 3 musicals I can name off the top of my head. There are 4 operas. There are graphic novels. There are television series that have done special episodes, Doctor Who, all these different shows that have done versions of A Christmas Carol. And I would challenge you to think about any Christmas movie or television show that you've ever seen and compare it back to Christmas Carol. I thought about taking us through all of Dickens' ideas here, nostalgia and redemption, and comparing them to everything, but I want you to take a moment at some point and take a look at It's a Wonderful Life. Because even in It's a Wonderful Life, and by the way, I think this is one of the great things about what Dickens does for Christmas, is that Christmas movies are not always just only about Christmas. And that's what makes them so great, I think. If you look at Christmas Carol, yeah, it's taking place at Christmas, but there are a whole lot of times where they're not dealing with anything that has to do with Christmas. But I challenge you to look at It's a Wonderful Life and think of it as the redemption for someone who's already good. Maybe Bob Cratchit. Maybe it's George Bailey is just a defeated Bob Cratchit. And I challenge you to find, because I haven't found one yet, any story or television show, film that isn't somehow based on A Christmas Carol. I'll end with this. Last night, I think that the one thing that strikes me about Charles Dickens and my experience working on the show with Meredy, it's been so wonderful, is that Charles Dickens gave the world a common story. I went home last night after we opened and I needed to decompress for a minute before I started working on this talk, and I was flipping through Netflix and I saw, oh, Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. I'm like, oh, that new Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. I hated it. I think I'll watch it again. And I sat there, I just told Megan this, I sat there and I cried probably through half of the movie. And I thought back to everybody's experience with James and Joanne Peach, and so many people we talked to were like, I remember this book as a child, I remember this common story. And I think that that's what Christmas Carol really gave us, is it gave us a common story. I told the cast last night that it's like Scrooge is one of our old ancestors, and we keep telling this story over and over again. And that it doesn't matter what religion you belong to, what faith practice you belong to, that Scrooge and his story at Christmas time is a commonality between us. Meredy said it best last night. She said, I don't remember a time in my life when I didn't know the story of Scrooge. Can you? I can't either. So as we head into the dark months and we leave this time of joy, well, we've got months, so let's not leave it too soon. But as we experience this time of joy, I hope and I say thank you to you for being with us through the warm months, and that we hope that you see us on the other side of the cold months, specifically for My Fair Lady. Enjoy the show. Thank you.